This week, Tom Scioli's Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, a bio in comics form and written in the first person from Kirby's perspective. And what's up with that? Why does Kirby look like a Tezuka character surrounded by normal humans? Emmet and I discuss those questions, some of the revelations this book made to us, and more. First, if you're enjoying this podcast, we'd love it if you'd support the show at patreon.com/deconcomics for as little as $2 a month. All patrons get our bi-weekly videos featuring 20th century TV trivia quizzes. More perks and bonus content at higher donation levels, including discussions of MCU movies and Lee Ditko Spider-Man stories. And help us meet our goals to unlock the earliest episodes of our podcast and put them all back in the feed. Pledge your support now at patreon.com/deconcomics. This is Tim.
And this is Emmet.
And this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo with Emmet in Australia. How are you doing? How are the kangaroos?
No sign of the kangaroos for a couple of weeks. The war has come to an abrupt end.
Okay.
I'm not sure why. And
well,
three people on this call. It's yourself, myself, and my 1-year-old kitten Wanda has decided to join me, and she's sleeping on my lap. So
okay.
Potentially, hopefully she won't interrupt us. She won't cut across, raise her objections to our arguments about Jack Kirby, but I just want to let you know.
I should mention some of your kangaroo stories. I think some of the drama has played out through our Patreon show, so not all listeners would have known about all that. I can't remember which conversations were in which podcasts, but
that's true. Yes. So for those who don't subscribe to Deconstructing Comics, and why aren't you?
And why not? Yes,
you're missing out on all this gold. I've been experiencing a rash of kangaroo dirty protests around our home. We moved to country Victoria almost exactly a year ago. Like a week or two ago, it was our anniversary here. And I noticed a few months ago that the kangaroos were gathering around our home at night and pooping on the doorstep. I'd step outside and this
precision strike. Just put it right where you're most likely to step in it.
Absolutely. And so that became part of my morning routine, just cleaning up around the house. But for some reason, there's been a sudden stop. So I don't know why.
Do kangaroos migrate? Do they go to a different part of the country?
I don't believe so, and I believe they're quite territorial. And our home is like backing onto bush. So there's bushland just beyond where my car is parked, basically. So we're on their doorstep, in effect, from their point of view. Like, we're in their space. I think that's what's going on. But I was playing it up for Tim and for the Patreon listeners. I was playing up that I was being personally targeted by these kangaroos for some reason. I was trying to figure out, what have I done?
Okay, well, here we are in Deconstructing Comics. This show has kind of been away for the past couple weeks because I've been busy, and I guess everybody's been busy. You and Kumar haven't had any additional episodes either. 2 weeks ago, we did a rerun of Mulele's and my older Patreon show about MCU movies. And then last week, I just, rather than put Critiquing Comics out on Saturday, I put it out on Wednesday in the Deconstructing Comics slot. But here we are finally back. One of the things I was doing these past weeks was working on this book, reading it 1.5 times, it turned out. This is Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics by Tom Scioli. And, boy,
it's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a thick tome as well, so well done for even getting through it 1.5 times. It's quite a big piece.
So, yeah, this book, the first thing that you notice about this book is it's told in the first person from Kirby's point of view. most of it. There are a couple of places where it takes other people's point of view, and then after he dies, there's not really any point of view. There's no narration after that. Yeah, and I guess Scioli based it on interviews that he found with Kirby over the years. So a lot of it, I think, is things that he said, fit into this format. But I don't know, what did you think of that approach?
I think it's a really interesting approach, actually, because it's sort of it's the first person narration, as you say. And there is an author's note at the very beginning to try and establish why he's taking that approach. Like, he's saying, look, this is not autobiography, this is not memoir, this is a literary device, it's using his point of view based on interviews that he's given. And what's interesting about that is, and I think we should talk about the chibi Kirby as well, which comes into
that's
this.
definitely on my list.
Yeah, but that in that sense, we have an idea in our mind, I believe. If you're a comics fan, you have a sense of Jack Kirby, and you have a sense of his voice. So Scioli making this decision actually is quite interesting, because then I feel as if we immediately have more sympathy for him, because there's this regard that Kirby was taken advantage of. Kirby was exploited. Kirby's works were marketed to the hilt, and he didn't see the profits of those works. So there is this notion of intimacy, both based on our sympathy for Kirby and also this notion of him talking to us. He's actually telling his story to us, and I think it's quite emotional in a way. So it's an interesting approach. I like it.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if I liked it at first, but I kind of got into it. But then when he switches to Roz's point of view, Jack's wife, the narration boxes are a different color, but at first I was kind of, what? Yes. I didn't quite get what was going on at first. After reading a box or two, I got it. And then later on, there's one segment told from Stan Lee's point of view, right at the point where Jack returns to Marvel around sometime late 50s, early 60s. I don't know the exact date.
It's the story about him, like Kirby finding him in his office crying into his hands. And it's a very familiar story to the two of us now, because we've read it now a couple of times from a couple of different writers.
Yeah, 4 times.
Yeah, and
Joe Maneely had just died, and Martin Goodman was talking about shutting Marvel down, or I guess it was still timely at the time.
Well, that's what I wanted to say. Sorry, Scioli taking that Stan Lee voice and including that Stan Lee voice, almost is sort of using his words as he's chosen to give us his words. But I think then Kirby cuts back and says, well, here's how I remember it. And I like that, because then it sort of conveys to us, there's a couple of different perspectives on what actually happened here. I'm going to present them to you.
Yeah, I think both of them say that in the book. Maybe we both have different points of view on what happened, or different memories of it. Or I think Jack says we both have bad memories.
Yeah, but as we talked about when we were doing the Stan Lee biography reviews, the Maneely stuff's really odd. The Maneely stuff, I just can't get over it, because I kind of feel like, and this is what I like about Scioli's approach to Kirby, he has these densely paneled pages, and whole incidents will get written off in a single panel. A major life change will occur within the bounds of a panel, and then
just kind of abruptly leave it in the next panel and go on to something else.
Which is very sort of old school comics, and that's Scioli's whole approach, which is to try and evoke this memory of what comics were, and that you see that in his other work as well. Now, with Kirby, his life is so rich, so much happened to him.
Oh my gosh!
World War II, the German-American Bund turning up outside Timely offices to beat him up. All this stuff with the CIA and Argo. He's working for animations. All the image generation sort of adopting him as a symbol for themselves. All these things happen to Kirby. Such a densely packed life of incident, and the paneling works to sort of convey that. With the Stan Lee stuff, we've read those books. There's this gap in his CV. Right? He leaves Marvel, and then he started making movies out of my comics. 30 years. I was just hanging around Hollywood. Kirby was working, and we see that in this work. The Meneely story feels to me like a tragic story that can be employed to evoke sympathy because all these other collaborators had all this hardship. He's got Meneely, right? Who can't actually correct the record.
Well, and we should say, just in case nobody's listened to our other reviews, that Joe Meneely was a comics artist who was good friends with Stan, at least Stan says so, and Joe one night had been out with somebody else and fell in front of a subway train and was killed. Yeah. And Stan had the idea that maybe he would have left with Joe and done some other kind of comics with him outside of Marvel, but we'll never know.
Yeah. The true tragedy of Joe Meneely is not the fact that he died so young. The tragedy is that Stan Lee didn't have a second career.
Well, and I was thinking, you get into that World War II stuff, and it's intense. You got people getting their heads blown up and all kinds of really bizarre, weird, horrible stuff. And, Jack says that, there were 1,000 guys in his unit and only he and 4 other guys survived.
Yeah.
And, you see that and you think, we came this close to not having Marvel in the 60s at all. If he had just been one of the guys who didn't survive, because, it was... What would that be? 0.4% of them survived?
It's so funny because there's an incident during the war where he's called up by a superior officer and he says, "Are you the artist behind Captain America?" And up to this point, he's been really pushing the fact that he's the artist. He's co-creator of Captain America with Joe Simon, and he feels he hasn't been given his due. And Marvel are now. Marvel basically later on resurrect Captain America, and it's credited to Stan Lee. Stan Lee created Captain America all of a sudden. So Kirby's got this chip in his shoulder about being the creator of Captain America. So this officer says, "Are you the creator?" And he says, "Yes, I am." Thinking he's going to get maybe a plush gig in, I don't know, like Stan Lee did in the propaganda office. And he said, "Okay, great. You're our scout. You go." Go ahead of us and go to these dangerous places and tell us what's there.
Draw maps.
Draw maps.
Because you're an artist, so you can draw maps of enemy territory.
Yeah, and then you show these narration in Jack's voice is like, okay, someone really hates me.
But yeah, let's get to how Kirby is drawn, because now it kind of sneaks up on you, because in the early pages, he looks like a normal human being. But then as he gets more into comics, and particularly I think it happens after the creation of Captain America in the 40s, suddenly he's got these huge eyes and his hair is 6 inches high at least. Matt Seneca in the Comics Journal says he resembles nothing so much as a Funko Pop.
Yeah. I read that review as well, and I also read, I think Kim O'Connor was talking about it on Twitter too, saying why the hell did Scioli do this? This is a really strange choice.
Well, I got the information on that.
Go for it.
I read an interview that Manuel Gomez did with him on monkeysfightingrobots.co. And Gomez asked him, "The way you draw Jack is very specific, especially compared to the other characters. What led to this wise decision?" Interesting, he calls it a wise decision, because Matt Seneca didn't think it was wise at all. Scioli says, "The story is told in the first person. I wanted the reader to live Jack's life, seeing things through his eyes. There's a technique Scott McCloud refers to in Understanding Comics. He calls the masking effect. Basically, the simpler and more cartoony you draw a character, the more the reader will identify with them. When you put that character in a naturalistic environment among realistic-looking characters, you have a strong identification with a detailed and sensual world to interact with and explore. There are lots of other effects that come out of that decision, but my main conscious reason for doing it was that."
I recognize that, and I think there's more to it as well. I don't think it's simply him taking McCloud's suggestion as writ and then following through. I also think it represents how divorced our fandom memory of Jack Kirby the man is from the financial and professional strain and suffering he labored under. This idea of Jack Kirby as symbol And I mentioned the Image guys. I mean, the fact that they sort of adopted him as their sort of image for why they had to revolt, because it was like, well, if we don't get out of here, we're going to end up like Jack Kirby. In effect, we're going to produce all this best-selling work for this company, and then we're not going to see a cut of the proceeds. Let's just do it ourselves and keep all the profits. What's interesting about that is they've used Kirby as a justification for their profiteering, not for their art, not for their, which I'm not having a go at that, because I think that's you absolutely get paid, and the life of Kirby is one that sort of suggests make sure you get paid. But I find it fascinating that the Image guys just focused on that, and if you look at the work they produced early days, a lot of it is seen to be, I think we can now admit to ourselves, it was pretty derivative stuff. Mm-hmm. But, it was sort of inspired by this idea of, well, if we're producing derivative stuff for a major company, why don't we get paid well for it? So I kind of feel like that's what it's as well. It's this notion of Kirby, the idea.
Right, so Jack Kirby in quotation marks. Yeah. And did you notice late in the book, there's a place where he's looking in the mirror, and the mirror image looks like a real Jack Kirby. I thought that was really interesting. That, it implies something.
Seeing himself as he is, yeah.
Yeah, he's seeing himself as he is, but, the cartoony one is kind of the one we see.
Exactly. And also it sort of speaks to Kirby's own approach to his comic work, where, he would do things like the New Gods, or where he's talking about these profound ideas around faith, the end of the world, apocalypses, man's ability to serve, like to submit to the control of another person or being, in this case Darkseid, which leads to fascism. So he's these big themes, but then you read the stories and there's these just goofy moments of there's goofy incidents and like ridiculous expressions, and he always had an ability to mix playfulness with profundity. And I think that's part of this as well. It's a very it's a serious work. It's an account of this man's life, but at the same time, there's a hook, because he looks this way. He, as I said, like a chibi doll, because he looks like this. There's a sense of it being more accessible. Now, I know people reacted against that. As you mentioned, the Matt Seneca review, and I mentioned Kim O'Connor sort of saying, why is this? But I genuinely think it's an interesting juxtaposition, and it sort of makes you think about what you're experiencing as you're reading it, as opposed to, say, if everything had been a sort of photorealist style, similar to the Colleen Doran, Peter David, Stan Lee illustrated biography that we read, where I actually, at a certain point, I remember just losing interest in it as I was reading it. It's just,
Yeah. Well, especially after you've read so many Stan Lee books, like, I know this story already.
Yeah.
And now I'm reading the less honest version of it. But anyway, the outsider might ask, why did Jack let himself get ripped off all the time? And he was, bringing in original ideas that were being brought into Marvel and, credited as written by Stan Lee. But according to this book, it's because, Jack had a growing family. I lost count of how many kids he had, and he was just concerned about getting some income right now to keep his family fed and keep a roof over their head. And of course he was just getting paid, work for hire, do the book, here's your pay. You don't own anything in it. So something that I never got around to saying in our Spider-Man stuff on Patreon, but, this book makes very clear that the Marvel method basically makes the artist the plotter always. I mean, we were concerned about when did Ditko start plotting Spider-Man. I think he started plotting Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy 15, probably, at least to some extent. I don't know, maybe he was having conferences with Stan in those days when they were talking to each other. But so, because a lot of these ideas were ones that Jack brought in that he had tried at previous publishers, or when he was working with Joe Simon and they had their own company. Like Fantastic Four was originally Challengers of the Unknown. He had a Spider-Man idea in the past that he tried a couple of times to work with, and then it got shelved. And he had an idea for a cigar-chewing army sergeant and his unit of misfit GIs, which of course became Nick Fury and his Howling Commandos. He had worked with Norse mythology a lot in past comics, so there's Thor.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was the big one. That was the Lee sort of was arguing in his books, his version of the stories, that, I thought of Thor, I thought we should use Thor, I always loved Norse mythology. And then you look at Kirby, who seemed to have been sort of paid to come in and do the story, but he's repeatedly used Thor. And he's clearly interested in this idea of mythology. Mm-hmm. And I thought it was good that this was established quite definitively here.
Yeah, and Stan would conveniently conflate writing the dialogue with writing the story, and so take all the credit for creating the characters. But it's interesting to compare Jack with Wally Wood, who was brought in to write Daredevil, and just balked at the Marvel business model and took a hike. And, of course, then Stan gets passive-aggressive in the narration boxes in the comic book, writing, Wally Wood wrote part 1 of this 2-parter last ish just for a lark, but now it's up to sly old Stan to put all the pieces together and make it come out okay in the end. Can he do it? See for yourself. It reminded me a lot of what we've seen in Spider-Man, too.
But all the digs at Ditko.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like, it's Stan Lee, like, being the ain't I a stinker, like the Bugs Bunny type line, but then like he's still doing it though. Like it's not play. It's actually representing what's happening. It's funny. When I read Scioli's book, he mentions that Kirby made an appearance on Bob Newhart's show Bob, where he plays a cartoonist in the 90s. He appears as himself at an awards show, and God, everybody's in this episode. Jim Lee's in this episode. Mark Silvestri's in this episode. He's apparently a very tall man. Sergio Aragonés is in this episode.
Wow.
Bob Wayne is in this episode. Bob Kane. Sorry, Bob Kane. Bob Wayne.
Not Bruce
Bob
Wayne,
Kane.
but Bob Kane.
Yeah, I always get those confused. And it's a very... It's fun to see all these sort of actual comic book people in this show, and it's very interesting for a nerd like myself, to watch this little clip. I found it on YouTube. I'll share it with you after this. But what I found fascinating was that Bob Newhart, then, the comedy bit is that he's accepting an award, but he's got this whole thing about people taking too long in their acceptance speeches. So he's trying to just get off the stage. So he starts cracking jokes about, I did everything. I don't have anybody to thank. And I was like, is this a Stan Lee thing? And
I didn't know Bob Newhart was that into comics, but it's whoever wrote that knew what he was doing, I think.
This is what I was just about to say. Mark Evanier was working on the show. So I think that's where that came from.
Or is it Evanier? I don't know.
Evanier, yeah.
Yeah, the age-old problem of trying to pronounce comics creators' names.
We've never heard them spoken in real life.
Yes.
Yes. So, like, Kirby's assistant and collaborator and very much champion.
Okay,
I believe
that explains a lot.
Yeah, I think he worked in this episode, and he would have known all these people to get them. I love the depiction of a comics award show that's like like very much high class affair, and I'm going, I think they were still doing these things in someone's basement at the time. But yeah, no, it's fascinating to watch. But yeah, I did wonder about that Bob Newhart. That the comedy of it is that he's playing this comic creator who's been brought out of mothballs. He's come back to resurrect this character who was shut down by the Comics Code crisis back in the day. The Senator Klinghoffer hearings, which makes an appearance in this, of course. And just seeing Kirby sort of being feted on the small screen as this major character, this personality, it was kind of sweet. I really enjoyed it, and I'm glad. I I think I dimly remember the show, but I never really watched it. But Scioli's just sort of throws in a mention to it. I was like, I need to check and see if this is on YouTube, and it is. You can watch the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't go looking for that, but I did look for some other things, like the Entertainment Tonight interview with Kirby. I found that on YouTube. So, yeah, the last part of the book, there's a lot of the stuff that you go looking for. Well, and not just in the last, early on, well, I think it's in the 50s, when he's working with Joe Simon, and they're doing crime books, and they're posing as characters for photos for the covers. And Scioli draws one of the covers in the book, but I found the original online on a number of different sites, with Kirby, in a trench coat and a hat. He's the criminal, and you can see the body of the cop. You can't see his face, but it's Joe Simon who is there, like, arresting this crook.
and Ross is typically playing the dame in distress type character as well in some of these photo shoots that they did. It's worth mentioning that the relationship between Kirby and Ross comes through so strongly. And there's some beautiful moments, and I mean, in particular, I'm fond of the one where, and again, it's the story I think we read in one of the books where Lee approaches Kirby at a Marvel anniversary event, and he's like, "Hey, let's work again together. Come on, let's do this thing." And Kirby's being polite and he's like, "Yeah, okay, I'd love to do that, Stan. That'd be nice." And Ross just comes over and says, "Nope," just takes Kirby away. Like her defense of him, it just came through so strongly.
Yeah. And there's a point where Roz helps him out by inking some comics, because she had fashion illustration experience, which she mentions in that scene. So, drawing was something she had a lot of experience with too, so she could do his inking if she had to.
Yeah, they were a team. And, it's sort of the contrast with Joan and Stan, where, like, was the major creative output of Joan's life seems to have been sort of a Stan Lee staged production again, where you've got the erotic novel, which I'd never heard of. Apparently it was a bestseller.
Coming up, was the tension between Lee and Kirby a case of Stan messing up Jack's story, or modifying it to better connect with the reader? And more. Don't forget you can help to unlock classic early episodes of Deconstructing Comics, help me return all the old episodes to this podcast feed, get videos of my brother Paul and me discussing 20th century TV trivia, and at the $4 level get access to hours of additional full-length podcasts. At the $10 level, you can review the book of your choice with me here on this show. Support Deconstructing Comics and our other shows at patreon.com/deconcomics. Or you can send a one-time donation via PayPal to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support.
Welcome to the Superman Fan Podcast. My name is Billy Hogan, and I will be your host. Before we begin our journey through the time barrier, please ensure that your red indestructible capes are securely fastened around your necks so that we may all travel safely into the past to explore the Silver Age adventures of the Man of Steel in the pages of Action Comics, Superman, Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, Superman's girlfriend Lois Lane, and World's Finest Comics. After we return from our journey, I encourage you to go to the website, thesupermanfanpodcast.blogspot.com. I look forward to have you join me each week to explore the Silver Age adventures of the Man of Steel.
Oh, there's so much in here. So Jack seems to have had a special affinity for the Silver Surfer, but also a lot of frustration because Stan kept messing up the story. Because he says that, while quoting, "My surfer is an angel, of being of pure energy, created by the hand of God. Stanley's was just another comic book scientist from a doomed planet." So I guess the whole concept of Surfer being Norrin Rad was Stan's idea.
Yeah, because he's got a lost love on the planet he's trying to save, all this kind of stuff. Yeah, that's the frequent criticism of Lee and Kirby, that Lee would attach, and the same thing with the Spider-Man stuff with Ditko. Lee would attach some sort of dramatic core. Lee would come up with some sort of what he believed to be a hook that people would be interested in, relationships, some sort of drama, romance, something like that. And Kirby seemed to be the pure ideas guy, and I think that's unfair. I do think Kirby had a sense of he basically saved the comic book industry with romance comics. I think he knows how to write romance. And he also had this amazing romance with Ross. But there is this argument that Lee was bringing in these dramatic staging grounds for these stories. I think Kirby's observation about Warlock is more to the point, where Kirby, and I went through a phase in my teenage years where I was obsessed with the character of Warlock. I just find him really interesting as a character. And he had a name. He had a whole other name for him. I can't recall what it was, but Lee insists that the character is called him. And the original concept is that Warlock is meant to be a satire on Ditko's objectivist views, his Randian views.
Ah, right.
So he's this perfect ideal created by this secret society. And so that's sort of getting into your whole Atlas Shrugged stuff. And Lee then, again, reverses it so they're foolish scientists, messing with things beyond man's ken, that kind of stuff. And in Scioli's retelling of this, Kirby's just disgusted again. He's ruined it. He's destroyed the point.
Yes.
And I think that's a clearer example of it, because what's happened there is Kirby's trying to satirize a concept, an idea, and Lee's turning it into just another yarn. And that's where it's been ruined. So the thematic core of the story is gone. It's just yet another situation that's very familiar. And maybe that's closer to what's actually happening. Kirby's interested in ideas and how ideas can power stories. Stan Lee is interested in giving people what they expect. And maybe that's the contrast.
Well, and maybe it was that, there was a lot of tension, but maybe it was that combination that sold comics. I mean, those Fantastic Four issues, they really sold. They had some of Kirby's concepts in them that were then, quote unquote, destroyed by Stan, to the point where Jack just kind of gives up and lets Stan do what he wants to do. And he complains about the ideas he brought me were real stinkers, like The Man Called Monocle, which I looked it up. It was Fantastic Four 95 from February 1970. So this is just before Kirby leaves Marvel. I have not read it. I don't know if it's a stinker or not, but Jack didn't think there was anything to it. But it kind of reminded me of all the crappy ideas that we know Stan came up with for Stan Lee Productions and POW Entertainment later.
Yes, you're right. And also the kind of weirdly disturbing concepts he had for essays in the 70s. What if rape was made legal? I'm sorry, I'll never forget that. It's not going to leave my brain. And you also have the suggestion in this that Galactus, the character Galactus, who's this iconic Marvel Comics threat, the Planet Eater, who, the Silver Surfer becomes his herald, all the rest of it. Galactus came out of an absence of Lee from The Office, where Kirby went directly to Goodman and said, I've got this idea. What if Fantastic Four had to fight God? Which is the story I've always heard. I've always heard that Lee and Kirby had this idea of Fantastic Four fighting God. What I didn't know was that it only got over the line because Goodman he went straight to Goodman in this version of the story. Again, we're dealing with people's retellings. But that does scan for me as being closer to what actually happened, because Galactus is such an extreme idea.
Yeah.
you can see it being pure Kirby. You can see the notion of him getting that over the line, and it's completely out of the bounds of the normal beginning, middle, end, meat and potatoes Stan Lee storytelling. It's just weird. That's why it works. And I think that's where, if Lee had been a better collaborator, maybe he would have been conscious of the tension that was there, and he would have leaned into it more in terms of, okay, well, he has these crazy ideas, I have these more ordinary ideas. Let's just play off one another, as opposed to trying to reshape the crazy ideas to something he could claim authorship over. That's where they fall out, because it's a question of authorship. Who's the creator?
Yeah. Well, like I said, the Marvel method meant that the artist was doing a lot of creating, and that in itself was not a bad thing. It's just, when it comes time to give credit, you have to be fair about it. And if somebody's writing the dialogue, credit them with writing the dialogue, but that's different from writing the story. Yeah,
and another story that emerges in this book that I'm learning more and more about with each of these pieces we do, these podcasts we do, was the incident where Marvel asked Kirby to join them in a countersuit against... was it a countersuit, or challenging Joe Simon's claim of title for Captain America?
Right,
so they're saying, come along with us. And the last book we read where they told the story, the version of events was that Kirby basically betrayed Joe Simon for a payout. In this version of the story, we learn that Kirby signs up with Martin Goodman and Marvel's case against Joe Simon. Joe Simon gets a good payout. Kirby doesn't. Kirby's basically lost title, and he's also being paid off with a piddling amount.
Yeah.
Whereas Simon was paid to go away, in effect.
So it doesn't make Kirby look as bad.
He's continually being shown here, at least, to be someone who was desperate to keep his job, who had a pronounced work ethic that he was committed to, and he just wanted to get paid for his work. And the company kept exploiting that, which, we knew, but it's very much grounded here in, as you say, his family finances, making sure there's a roof over his kid's head. I think he has 4 children before the end of the story, and then grandchildren and so on and so forth. So, there is this sense of him just trying to get paid for the work he's doing and not receiving a fair due. Particularly when he finds himself, when he's out of Marvel, he's in effect competing with himself because they keep reprinting stuff he's done. And he's trying to get new stuff out.
He's not getting paid for any of that.
Yeah, no. Yeah.
But actually, this book made me more interested in reading his DC stuff, because I've never read any of that, the New Gods stuff. That might be something we could do for the podcast, because I'm curious about it now.
I really like the New God stuff. I came to it very late as well. I came to it because I remember reading Grant Morrison's Final Crisis, and how they were clearly evoking Kirby in that contrast between the ordinary and the fantastic. I was interested in that. I wanted to learn more about that. And then Tom King did his Mr. Miracle book, and Kumar and I did a review for this podcast about that, and my impression was, he doesn't get it. He thinks he's deconstructing the New Gods idea, but he's actually produced a more superficial version of the same concept. The juxtaposition isn't working here. He's actually lost the juxtaposition, because the fantastic has just become dull in this take on Kirby. So I then went to the source. I read the original stuff, and it's very good. It's you can see the deadline pressure at times. You can see the efforts to sort of rein him in, to make him cohere with the DC universe. It really should be a whole thing on itself. It should be a whole universe to itself. It shouldn't be attached to DC.
Yeah, I mean, if Kirby had lived a couple decades later and everything else is the same, then he could have a creator-owned book at Image or something.
Yeah, exactly. And I would like to read Scioli's book with Joe Casey, Godland. I think I read some of the later issues, and it was a bit lost on me. But I'd like to revisit that stuff because I've liked some Scioli stuff in the past. Like I really liked Satan's Soldier, which is like his version of what an evil Superman would be like, and things like that. I like his style. I like the roughness of his style. I like how he sort of evokes this attempt at a Kirby action art, but without the processed, clean computer art version of superhero comic art that we have today. It's sketched out in butcher's paper like Ed Piskor, and I just read Frank Santoro's Pittsburgh the other day. All these guys in Pittsburgh are doing this sort of comic art and butcher's paper thing, and I love it. I think it's really good because it evokes. It's clearly meant to be a version of superhero comics that are outside of the studio system, but they're reflective of the cultural impact of the studio system. So they're still about superheroes and our memory of superhero comics, but they don't look like contemporary superheroes, which are very clean and all the rest of it. So I really want to get back into Godland because I wonder if Scioli is not only evoking a memory of Kirby, but trying to, get the spirit of Kirby's original concepts through to the finish line. And that all goes back to New Gods. I've never read The Eternals either, but I recently started reading Kieran Gillen and Esad Ribick's version of The Eternals. They did a new storyline based on it, and it's bloody great. Really, really good. And
well, yeah, I know nothing about the Eternals and the movies coming up, and so I'm kind of curious about that too.
It's a really interesting concept, and my memory of it is that once again, and like in this version of the story, Kirby is saying, "All right, I'm going to get all these concepts over the line as soon as possible because I don't want to get cancelled again." But my memory of it is that they started pulling the Eternals more and more into the Marvel space as well. He's clearly itching, just as you say, just do an original work. Just leave me alone. Just let me do my thing.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
We should mention. Well, I've got several things here. Some of them are kind of minor, but I wanted to get them in anyway.
Sure.
But not minor is that. Well, we mentioned the war experience, and that it's really full on in this book for a surprising length of pages. But I think you can't undersell how much that affected his work, in the following decades. Not just, like Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos, but a lot of things that he did later.
Perhaps his experience of the Holocaust and the concentration camps, because that relates to a lot of the New God stuff.
Okay.
Right? You've got, as I keep alluding to Darkseid as a symbol for fascism, but yeah, Scioli, because he's quoting Kirby was apparently working on this novel for a couple of years, and the concept behind the novel was this mass of humanity, this mob sort of rises up and is threatening society as a whole, and that seems to have come out of his war experiences as well, where he's witnessed this. We talk about Nazi ideology as being pure evil, but I think he witnessed how it came from ordinary people, and that's what made it terrifying. And yeah, he's sort of, and then his experience as well of barely surviving multiple times.
What I wanted to say was, now I have not read these either, but the early Avengers issues after Captain America comes back, and apparently Cap suffers from PTSD, and he's mourning Bucky because he's just found out Bucky died, even though it was decades ago. So that's clearly drawn on Jack's own war experience too, and coming back from the war. Yeah,
or even Captain America exiting the war by being frozen and Kirby basically being discharged because he collapsed and he had frostbite, and so he and Scioli again draws that connection between the two of them, where he's saying, well, Captain America and Kirby more or less left World War II through the same method.
Yeah, because
freezing.
of ice.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so the minor things. So we talked in a recent Spider-Man 1963 episode about Steve Reeves.
Yes, the Hercules.
And the Hercules movies. Again, so there were exactly 2 of those films. They were made in the 50s. But in this book, Jack says in Italy they were making a bunch of movies starring Steve Reeves, and he's saying this like in the mid 60s. So apparently everybody in the 60s saw these movies as recent. I mean, I guess they were like 1958 and 59, but there were not a bunch of them, just 2.
Yeah. I mean, we need to remember as well, these are older men too.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
they're not like heading out to the jazz club to check out what the kids are bopping to these days, and they're not going to the underground cinemas and I don't know, watching Kev Anger or something. They were very much sort of watching the entertainment that they want to watch. And the culture at the time is still catering more so to the 30-something plus professional than the teenager. So potentially that's where we've seen this, where we've noticed that there's this contrast with today, where so much of our culture today is focused on, 10-year-olds to 16-year-olds. Like, it's incredible how much of the cultural industry is just focused on this subset of adolescence. And maybe we, having come up through this sort of descending importance, the descending age limit, we're noticing, in these days they were making content for adults, or for adults who are nostalgic for stuff from the 50s and the 60s. Potentially. I don't know.
Other thing was, kind of 2 parts to this. In the interview that I watched with Scioli on YouTube. Sorry, I forgot which interview it was. There are tons of them out there, all from last year when this book came out. He mentions that he, struggled to get the chronology right of, when did this happen in relation to this. I found one place where he really goofed on that.
Okay.
And it's later on. So he shows Jack, working with the Image guys in the early 90s. And then, like, some pages later, he mentions Leon Klinghoffer. Now, this kind of blew my mind. Do you know? Okay. Were you familiar with Leon Klinghoffer? No. So, because I remember when this happened, it was 1985. So, before Image existed, but Leon Klinghoffer was on a cruise ship that the Achille Lauro that was hijacked by the PLO, and Klinghoffer stood up, well, not literally, but he fought back against the PLO, and they shot him and threw him overboard. And it's mentioned in here, and Jack says, somebody from my block, because he knew him as a kid in New York, somebody from my block would do that. Someone, they'd fight back against terrorists hijacking their ship. So it kind of blew my mind that he knew Klinghoffer, because I would never in a million years have made that connection. But also, Scioli put it in the wrong spot in the book chronologically.
Yeah, is it okay? I'm going to look that up, because is that actually him saying that happened at that time, or is it his sort of memories? Well, he's thinking these are towards the end of his life. Not
clear. You know how this book works. So, like, here's incident. In each one's one panel, maybe, but just where Scioli placed it was not chronological.
Okay, sure.
Maybe it didn't fit in well in the actual place where it occurred chronologically. I didn't try to figure out where it would actually go, but
because that would be his animation years.
Yeah,
Sundar the Barbarian type period.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And well, since you mentioned the animation stuff, it reminds me. So you go through this book, and like again and again, not every time, but frequently it's like, I had this really great idea and I poured all this work into it and then it flopped, or then it didn't get printed. And so, it's shocking then when he gets into animation and he's like making all this money and everybody's bowing down and worshiping him. It's like by that point, he's having the Adam West experience where, the kids who loved his work when they were growing up are now adults and want to work with him and give him a lot of money. So, you just, once you survive the lean years, then your kid fans grow up and give you work. And so, in the 80s, he's reached that point.
Well, didn't we have the same thing with Stan Lee, where in the 80s, he's getting all these meetings in Hollywood with these people who love him, these studios, but they just want to meet him. They don't give him work. They don't
That's true. Yeah. I think they, maybe loved Stan, but at the same time, their BS detectors went off, and so they passed on actually working with him.
I have this funny feeling that the animated show, one of the animated shows that Kirby's said to have worked on, is this. I don't have the page in front of me. Was it Turbo Teen, where the kid turns into a car? Mm-hmm. I'm pretty sure I watched that.
Okay.
For sure. Like Thunder the Barbarian, I don't believe I ever saw it, but I remember hearing about it. And I was really into He-Man at the time, so I would have been on the look for other stuff like that. But I never actually saw Thunder the Barbarian. But I've always been curious to watch it.
I remember watching the Fantastic Four cartoon in, what was it, late 70s, I think. That would have put me in junior high. So I was getting a little old for Saturday morning cartoons, but because it was Fantastic Four, I did watch it. I had never known the real reason that, I don't think I knew, why Human Torch was not in that cartoon. I think I was operating on the assumption that the producers were afraid that kids would try to set themselves on fire to imitate Human Torch, but
that's exactly what I was told too. Because I saw that as a kid on repeats as well. They were showing it again. But the version of this in this story is different.
Yeah, it says that the rights to Human Torch were tied up on another potential TV pilot, which I guess never saw the light of day. But yeah, it was a rights issue. And so they replaced him with Herbie the Robot, who was more or less created by Jack, as I recall, from from this book. So that was interesting.
And it's explicitly mentioned that it's a Star Wars. Yeah,
it's like R2-D2 combined with Herbie the Love Bug.
Yeah, I do love the appearance of Star Wars in this book too, where
look, Darth Vader on the screen. That's basically Dr. Doom up there. And I've had that thought, growing up. I remember, like, I think of a story like, wait a minute, was that Dr. Doom or Darth Vader that I'm thinking of?
Yeah, and then there's a return to like another shot. It's Roz and Jack in the cinema watching Empire Strikes Back, and you've got the reveal of Luke's parentage, and this then ties up with Orion and Darkseid. So like you just see Kirby going, "God damn it!"
No, he says, "Son of a bitch," is what he says.
I laughed at that actually. But like that's been something that people have said for a couple of decades now, that Darth Vader owes a lot to Doctor Doom, that Darkseid, that there's a clear Jack Kirby influence on Star Wars. And I think there's a moment in this book where Luke is having a meeting with Stan Lee, if I remember correctly, and he asks about Kirby, or Kirby's mentioned, and this gets back to Kirby. So he's aware that this young guy is like really into his stuff, and so I think he's keeping an eye on him then, because he's like, what's he taking from me? And like a lot, as it turns out.
Yeah, well, it sounds like Lucas was probably reading those books in the 60s.
Yeah. The New Gods in particular, because you got this idea of the Uniforce, the Force, dark side, the relationship between Orion and Darkseid. You can see the parallels. They're there.
Mm-hmm. And maybe it never came up much because the general public didn't know about these comics.
Absolutely. Well, that's it. I mean, you can just riff on this stuff. I do find it funny that Roz says to Kirby something like, everyone else is ripping off everyone else. You're the only one who has to be original. and he goes home and then he tries to rips off Prince Valiant. And he comes up with Etrigan the Demon, which again, like, amazing. I love that so much. Hal Foster. Apologies to everyone listening.
Hal Foster,
probably screening at your phones.
Okay. Well, is there anything else we need to touch on here?
Well, we've kind of touched on it, but I think it's something of a truism that, you know, Tom Scioli is a Kirby devotee. You know, I just kind of want to unpack that a bit more. Like his, you know, the less processed, less refined version of the Kirby style. I think it's fascinating. I think it's really interesting what he does. I actually think it's very appealing because it does speak to. It conveys to me a sense of remembering or a memory. And also, like, I love this sort of Pittsburgh scene because I believe him and Pitzker and Santoro are all from Pittsburgh. And they're all using this, as I mentioned before, this butcher's paper type thing. But I love it because to me it suggests it's encouraging an artist to just get out the pencils and just start drawing. Like, just use whatever material you have to hand. Just do a story. You've made a comic now. You know, I like that. I like that a lot. It's less gatekeepery than the sort of house styles of Marvel, DC, and to some degree Image have become in recent years. This notion of a closed shop. No, you can tell a story. You can make a story. Nothing's stopping you. So yeah, I just really like how he's sort of tried to liberate Kirby, if you like, from these license holders that own all of Kirby's concepts now.
Okay. Yeah, like I said, I would be interested in doing some New God stuff for the podcast if you're up for it.
Absolutely. I've read the New God stuff. I've never read the Jimmy Olsen stuff. So I just read the New Gods, the actual title New Gods, and I've read like Morrison's version of it and King's version of it, and Simonson's version of it, which is good actually. I don't mind Simonson's stuff, but the one that I really would like to read, and if you want to get into it on this podcast, I'd love to get into the Hunger Dogs, which is mentioned here as Kirby's attempt to complete the saga, and then he's getting knocked back because they can't sell toys if all the characters get killed.
Right, yeah, he has to redo it several times because, you know, he has to treat the properties right. So, yeah. Well, we'll have to figure out how we can divide it up so that we're not reading thousands of pages for one episode.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's potentially another mini-series in and of itself. I am laughing at the idea of them saying you can't do a comic with these characters if they get killed off at the end. You know, in recent years we've seen, you know, Batman versus Superman, where Superman dies. You know, when I was a kid, the Transformers movie came out, and a bunch of characters got killed in that, including Optimus Prime. And they sold lots of toys, so you know. I think they were wrong on that one. They should have let him.
Yeah, challenging the conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
Okay. But would you recommend this book?
I would. I really enjoyed it. I thought I think what we've been dancing around and talking about it is this sense of Kirby, the person, comes through in a very warm way. And I have a great deal of sympathy for Jack and Roz as a result of their experience. And their relationship is really the core of this book. And I think that's quite beautiful. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, so did I. And it filled in a lot of gaps in my knowledge of what was happening both in the Marvel years and otherwise. So, yeah, I would definitely recommend it.
Like, I'm sure somebody can come back to us, and we welcome your comments, folks, but I'm sure someone can come back to us and say, well, this is pure hagiography. And I go, well, yeah. But we've had 60 years of Lee, so why not?
Yeah, well, and also reading this after reading those Stan Lee books was interesting contrast. See a different point of view on the story. Yeah,
and I think I've got a new quest every now and then I set myself upon an object, some sort of object of pop culture memory that I have to then track down. But I'm really curious to read, if it's possible to read, the Harvey Comics stuff that he and Joe Simon did that flopped because Marvel had flooded the market with their concepts. The Stuntman book that they did looks really interesting, because in this account of it, Kirby says, I put everything into this. This was going to be the greatest thing I've done. And it just dies. So I'd be really curious to read that stuff.
Yeah, I wonder if that's published anywhere.
Yeah. IDW or somebody went through the archives and republished it. I don't know.
Yeah. Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics, is published by 10 Speed Press. You can help Deconstructing Comics and all our podcasts by joining us on Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. And go to deconstructingcomics.com to connect to us on Twitter, Facebook, or YouTube, to shop on Amazon to support the show, and to find links to subscribe to the podcast. Our theme is by J.B. Anderton. If you're looking for some constructive feedback on your comic, send it to us and we'll critique it on our spin-off podcast, Critiquing Comics. Send it to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. We'll read at least 30 pages of it and critique it on the show. And by the way, we currently have no submissions for Critiquing Comics, so if you've been looking for a good time to submit, it's now. Next week, while I scramble to put the next episode together, we'll have another edition of Tim Catches Up with the MCU, in which Mulele and I discuss Guardians of the Galaxy. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.